Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami guru ishwaram itam Shri Radhika Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhuttanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohana Adadanaśrinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhira Pali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Vilashati Palashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajanola Samanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajandhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir Yanikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalukavat Gurutara Prem Naiva Tasyai Namah Yaramya Nikilaga Shanga Shamani Shutratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajandra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali, and in particular we're in the prakaran on Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, and more specifically the section within that on Vaiṣṇave jāti buddhi, or the notion of a caste in relation to a Vaishnava. So today we'll look at the commentaries on Srimad Bhagavatam 3.33.7 in continuation of the discussion on the commentaries on 3.33.6 that we discussed in the last class. So these are relevant to this discussion because they're cited by Sri Rupa Gosvami, Sri Sanatana Gosvami, as well as Sri Jiva Gosvami, specifically in regard to this subject matter. And we got onto this topic because in the book Rasamrita Sindhu, it was explained that a Vaishnava, or rather anyone who is said to have once chanted the name of Bhagavan, is immediately eligible to conduct a Soma Yaga. So what does, quote, immediate eligibility mean? We went through the commentaries in that regard, and according to Jiva Gosvami, and as supported by commentaries of Vishwanath Chakravarti and Sanatana Gosvami, the meaning was that they're immediately absolved of the sin that resulted in them receiving a birth that was ineligible to receive the Upanayan Samskar, whereby they would become eligible to conduct this yajna. But not that they would literally go and conduct the yajna in this birth, but rather, according to Jiva Gosvami, that they would need to be born again in a suitable family, and then receive the Upanayan Samskar according to the rules governing how the Upanayan Samskar is administered in the Smriti Shastras. So this verse in 337 further underscores the significance of what Kapila Dev originally meant in the Bhagavatam, and will also, as referred to last time, look at an additional point that relates to the previous verse that's given by Vishwanath Chakravarti in his comments on this latter verse, which has also at times been a subject matter of conversation because Vishwanath Chakravarti gives a little bit of a different viewpoint than Jiva Goswami gives on this subject matter. So whenever that happens, then there's always necessarily some call for further deliberation to understand why these acharyas have offered unique viewpoints. So, without further ado, we'll pick up from where we left off. This understanding that a dog cooker who has most fortunately performed an act of bhakti, and all the more a recipient of Vaiṣṇava Diksha who is adherent to the path of Uttama Bhakti, has nothing to gain by literally receiving a Savitra birth and performing a Soma Yaga, and rather who would only be digressing from their own best interest by doing so, is also indicated in the following aforecited statement in Srimad Bhagavatam 3.33.7. Aho bata, how astonishing! A dog cooker on the tip of whose tongue your name is present is thus highly honorable. Those who take your name have undergone austerity, conducted sacrifices, bathed in all tirthas, become noble, and studied the Veda. Sri Sanatan Pad elaborates on Sri Samipad's commentary on this verse as follows. Aho bata is said in the sense of astonishment. So colloquially, this would be equivalent in English to something like, oh wow! In other words, it's just an emotive particle, but it can convey different emotions, so he's clarifying that the emotional sense of this expression is that of astonishment. So what's astonishing? He, even a dog cooker, that is, even one who is sinful in two ways, because of non-discontinuance from being liable for the consumption of dog meat on account of caste, that is, because of still being part of a caste that consumes dog meat, and action, that is, because of still eating dog meat oneself, on the tip of whose tongue your name is present, or on the tip of whose tongue is present a name, even the meaning of which is you. That is, who utters even a semblance of your name, even inaccurately, even in whatever manner, and even without shraddha and so forth, is thus, for that very reason, that is specifically by virtue of uttering your name, highly honorable. So this is very strong language coming from the Bhagavatam, what Sanatana Gosvami is drawing out. So he's saying, even if someone, they don't have any shraddha in Bhagavan, they haven't even actually chanted a name of Bhagavan. Maybe they have, or maybe they've just said a conventional word that's referring to Bhagavan, but isn't even a word that we think of as one of his names. If that is the case, and even if they're still engaged in regularly eating meat, while they do so, still, the Bhagavatam says, they are here highly honorable. So, once chanting the name in that manner, if that is sufficient to make someone highly honorable, then the question might arise, well, how is that possible? Why is that? Therefore, a question is raised, why is that? Thus, she, meaning Devahuti, who's speaking this statement, says, verily they who take your name have undergone, that is fully performed austerity, Verily they have conducted sacrifices, bathed in the tīrthas, become noble, that is, possessed of righteous conduct, and studied the Veda. Austerity and so forth, all righteous action is included in repetition of your name. That is, by repeating your name, one acquires all the merit that one can acquire by means of austerity and so forth. Thus, they, those who take your name, are most meritorious, is the meaning. So, whatever merit you can achieve by performing sacrifices, by going on pilgrimages to tīrthas, by observing various types of meritorious conduct, all of the benefit that you can get from those things is achieved just by performing kirtan, just by repeating Bhagavan's name. So that alone makes them most meritorious. This is Sanatana Gosvami's interpretation. So, Sri Jiva stresses the primary import of the verse more pointedly in his Krama-sandarbha-tika. So that was strong language. Nevertheless, Jiva Gosvami makes it even more strong in his commentary. So he gives it as follows, quote, therefore, even that which is stated in the previous verse, quote, even a dog eater immediately becomes eligible to perform a soma yaga, is nothing. That's no great praise at all, since austerity and so on, everything that is mentioned in this verse shall verily be included just in taking his name. So his point is, by repeating Bhagavan's name, one acquires all the merit that one can acquire by means of austerity, observing the conduct of the twice-born, studying the Veda, performing yagyas like the Soma Yaga, and so on. Since indeed one who takes his name shall also possess superiority to performers of austerity and so forth. That is, one will acquire even greater merit. Intending this, she says, Ahu Bata. How amazing. So what he wants to say is that someone who is born in a family of the higher varnas, who receives all the samskaras, who performs many righteous activities, who's very cultured, who has a very prestigious position within this society, everything that they can achieve by doing that, all of that and more can be achieved by anyone, even if they don't have any faith, and even if they're engaged in eating meat, and in all these other things. Anyone, by taking the name, can achieve something as much or more meritorious. This is what is being conveyed in the verse. So if that's not enough for you, Chakravarti Pad puts even more leverage on this point, and he gives an extended commentary on this verse. So lastly, Sri Chakravarti Pad stresses the purport of this verse even more pointedly, and draws out even further implied meaning in his Sarartha Darshani. Quote, even that which was stated in the previous verse, even a dog eater who somehow engages in bhakti immediately becomes eligible for savana, is nothing, that is no great praise, since his, that is the aforementioned dog eater's, veritable superiority even to performers of the Soma Yaga shall come about consequently. Thus, Devahuti says, Ahu Bata, meaning, this which is now stated in the Bhagavad 333.7 is an astonishment, even in comparison to the astonishment described in the previous verse, that even a dog eater is said to immediately become eligible for savana. That is, if it didn't shock you that saying that taking the name makes you eligible to perform a yajna that only Brahmas can perform, then this next statement is really going to shock you. So what does it say? On the tip of whose tongue means only on the tip of a dog eater's tongue, and not rather on the entirety of it. The sense being that the name is uttered inaccurately. Means they didn't even sing beautifully or in a charming way. They didn't even use the entirety of their tongue or pronounce it properly. Furthermore, the name is said to be, quote, only present and not rather finished or fully articulated. The sense being that it is uttered incompletely. So a name of Bhagavan that's not uttered properly and not even fully pronounced. The mention of, quote, name in the singular indicates only one and not rather names. That is, it refers to a dog cooker who has only once inaccurately and incompletely uttered only one name of Bhagavan, and not many names of Bhagavan, or even one name of Bhagavan many times. What more then of many names uttered completely on the entirety of the tongue? In other words, then how much benefit is there in someone uttering many names properly, using their entire tongue and pronouncing them accurately? Wow! Therefore, he, a dog cooker, is highly honorable. That is, he becomes exceedingly great. The purport is that he acquires the eligibility to teach the mantra constituted of the name even to others. An objection is raised. Well, then let he, this dog cooker, engage in yajna, study of the Veda, austerity, and so on. To this, she says, tīrthe'mbu. So if you say, oh, this person who's an outcast, but who chanted the name, he's so purified, he's so meritorious, he's so this. Okay, well then let him do all the things that the people who follow the path of karma do. Let him perform yajna, let him act like a Brahmin, essentially. So, is that what the verse means to say? No, according to Chakravarti Pāda. So he structures it like this, that if Kapila Dev or a listener thought, okay, well then let this person do this, to this she replies, tīrthe'mbu. She states the second half of the verse, what to speak of him alone, even others who take your name, they alone have undergone austerity. This ascertainment of the meaning of the statement is gathered from non-observation of others' austerity, being complete in entirety. In this way, because of the non-mention of any particular qualifier of the austerity said to have been accomplished by those who take Sri Bhagavan's name, indeed all austerity is the intended sense, meaning anyone who has taken Sri Bhagavan's name has acquired the benefit of performing full austerity completely. And it is only those who take Sri Bhagavan's name that ever acquire such benefit, since it is not observed that those who actually physically engage in austerity ever perform it with absolute completion. They alone, that is, those who have taken Sri Bhagavan's name, have conducted sacrifices. They alone have bathed verily in all the tīrthas. They alone are noble and not others. They alone have studied the Veda. So someone who meagerly, partially, inaccurately, faithlessly, while engaged in misconduct, pronounces Bhagavan's name, achieves more completely the merit than people who spend their whole life trying to conduct yajnas and perform austerities and so on. This is strong language, to say the least. Because of the specification of the past tense in this verse, in, quote, they have undergone and so on, that is, in the words juhuvu, sashnu, and anuchu, and the specification of the present tense in take, grinanti, only your names are being taken by them in the present. All austerity, sacrifice, and so on has been performed in the past, and is not rather being performed by them in the present, or going to be performed by them in the future. In other words, he's drawing out here that because the person who said with a verb in the present tense to take the name has in the past tense done all these things, which they've literally never done, but are said to have done because they've acquired merit that's equal and greater to having done them, the implication of the usage of the tense is that this person who's achieved all of that and more by in the present taking the name, would he then go back and do these other activities that are more difficult and produce less benefit? In other words, if you get a job and you're making, $100 grand a year, and then someone says, would you like this other job that pays you a quarter of that? It's like, no one goes, yeah, let me go back and do that. They're already achieving far more by doing what they're already doing. So the implication is that they would never go back and do those other things. They've already achieved whatever you could by doing them, and are achieving more as well in the present. Therefore, why would they perform them again? They would not. Thus, the non-eligibility of bhaktas for all such karmas is fit to be understood. So listen to what he's saying. So therefore, bhaktas have no adhikar to go and study the Veda, to go and do these austerities, to go and do these types of conventional pilgrimage. That it's actually improper for bhaktas to spend their time doing that, because it would be such a devastating opportunity cost. In other words, they're benefiting so profoundly from what they're already doing. To give that up and go do this other thing wouldn't do them any good. On account of the usage of words ending in the affix lit, indicative of an unperceived past, or paroksha, that is, on account of the verbs which are conjugated in the perfect past tense, namely tepu, ju, hu, vu, susnu, and anuchu, they, that is, those who take Bhagavan's name, do not know that aforementioned austerity and so forth, that is, the austerity, sacrifice, bathing, study, and so on described in the verse, has verily been accomplished by them by means of taking Sri Bhagavan's name, much less do they know, that is, have any experience of the exertion of those practices. This is the purport. That is, those who take Sri Bhagavan's name acquire the benefit of having performed numerous practices found in the path of karma, which require great exertion to accomplish. And they also do so without having to undergo any such exertion themselves. So he's saying that the past, in Sanskrit, you have 3 different types of past tense. And one of them is used for a past activity which was not seen by the speaker. And another was used for a past activity which was directly observed by the speaker. So the type of past tense that is used in this verse is the one that's used to refer to an unperceived past event. So, and of course, each tense has a range of meanings, but Chakravartipad is picking out this meaning and saying that the paroksha bhutkal, or the past that's perceived by another, implies that the bhaktas never did these things and didn't even have any notion that they're doing these things, and just by chanting the name is getting the benefit of it all. So what he essentially wants to say is that chanting the name gives you everything and more, with the least problems and the least worries, and it's so beneficial you might not even realize how beneficial it is while you're doing it. Okay. Especially noteworthy, first in this commentary, is that Sri Chakravartipad construes the honorability of the dog cooker, who is described in 333.7, as having only once inaccurately and incompletely uttered only one name of Bhagavan, to not only be equal to that of a performer of the Soma Yaga, but rather to be greater than that. Secondly, he specifies that this greater honorability is specifically eligibility to teach a mantra constituted of a name of Bhagavan to others. This further demonstrates that the intent of these 2 verses in the Bhagavatam is not to suggest that a dog cooker who has performed an act of bhakti can and should literally go and perform a Soma Yaga, after going through the process required to become eligible to do so by accepting the Savitra mantra and so forth, but rather that such a dog cooker, by virtue of engaging in bhakti and being purified by bhakti, acquires the honorability of being eligible to teach bhakti to others, which is a state of honorability greater than that of the twice-born on the path of karma who perform a Soma Yaga. Thirdly, Sri Chakravartipad specifically raises the question of whether the purified dog cooker described in 333.6 should literally go and engage in acts of karma like conducting a Soma Yaga. And he shows that the intent of 333.7 is to indicate that there is no need or benefit in doing so. since a person who has somehow engaged in an act of bhakti has actually, without any exertion and hardship, attained a benefit that is greater than all the benefit anyone on the path of karma who does literally perform a soma yaga or engage in study, austerity, and so on, can ever achieve. Finally, in regard to 333, 6, and 7, it should also be mentioned that Sri Chakravarti Pad in his Bhaktisar Pradarshani Tika on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.1.22 offers an additional alternate interpretation or explanation of the statement in 333.6 that a dog cooker purified by bhakti, quote, becomes qualified for savana, in which he presents a view that differs from the view originally expressed by Sri Samipad, which Sri Jiva Pad followed in his 3 commentaries on this verse, and which Sri Chakravarti Pad himself also followed in his aforecited explanation in his Sarita Darshan. So last time there was a question at the end about this other interpretation of Chakravarti Pad, so now we're coming to that. So we have Swami Pad, Jiva Goswami 3 times, and Chakravarti Pad himself all saying one thing. And then we have this one other commentary of Chakravarti Pad where he gives a different interpretation. So Chakravarti Pad is differing not only from Sridhar Swami and Jiva Goswami, but also himself in this commentary he gives in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So this is the context. So he's obviously not an incoherent writer, and he's obviously entitled to offer more than one interpretation. So we'll look at what else he said, but we want to hold it or recognize it within this frame. So this is his second commentary. He says, eligibility here refers specifically to the essential nature of eligibility for performance of yaga. That is, it refers directly to being a bearer of eligibility for performance of yaga, and not only to consideration of one being respectable like one who has eligibility for performance of yaga. So this is the essential difference. Sridhar Swami said that the, quote, equality with a Brahmana is pujyatva, or worshipability, honorability like a Brahmana. But Chakravarti Pad is saying, no, if the Bhagavad itself is saying they're qualified to do the yajna, then why say that that just means that they're respected as if they would do it? Why not just take it at more face value, which arguably, and for Chakravarti Pad, it seems like a more natural reading of the Bhagavatam itself, is if it says they're qualified to perform yajna, then why aren't they just considered qualified? Why are bringing this point of respect out of the reference? And obviously we heard why, and there's a good reason why, but this is nevertheless a valuable, tangible point, that it's a more natural or literal reading of the Bhagavatam to take it like this. So he raises this point and says the eligibility here means the eligibility itself, not just being respectable like someone who has it. So he goes on, when in regard to the statement, quote, he becomes qualified for savana, the explanation is given, quote, he becomes respectable like a performer of the Soma Yaga, as was given by Sri Jiva Pad following the explanation of Sri Samipad. It is because of an incidence of far-fetched interpretation of the text. So here Chakravarti Pad is point blank saying that Samipad and Jiva Goswami, their view is far-fetched for me on this subject matter. And he says, it is because of an incidence of far-fetched interpretation of the text, and why so? Because of an incidence of incongruity with the original text. Now why is it incongruous? Since only eligibility for savana has destructiveness of commenced sin, and respectability does not. Similarly indicate that one's commenced sin has been destroyed. So Rupa Goswami is quoting this verse in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu to prove that bhakti has the power to destroy prarabdha karma, or prarabdha sin. So he's saying if Rupa Goswami is quoting this verse for that purpose, then is your prarabdha karma, or your prarabdha sin, really removed if you've just achieved the status of being respectable like the people who don't have that? If Rupa Goswami's whole point is that your prarabdha karma is really gone, then wouldn't it be more likely that he meant to cite this verse to say that your prarabdha is really gone because you literally are now able to do this yajna. Respectability doesn't necessarily equate to your sin being gone, but literally being eligible to perform the yajna does. So he's saying, this is a more natural reading of the Bhagavatam, and this also is what Rupa Goswami could have meant when he cited this in the Sindhu. So he's bringing this out like this, and he gives a further reason for his line of thought by saying that on account of observation of the respectability of jnanis possessed of commenced sin, existent as a cause of low caste status of that nature, that is, of the nature of a dog cooker, meaning jnanis are seen to be possessed of both prarabdha sin and the quality of being respectable. So, having the quality of being respectable does not indicate that one's prarabdha sin has been destroyed. And since the intent of the statement in 333.6 and the intent of the author in citing this statement in the Sindhu 1.1.21 is to show that a bhakta has prarabdha sin destroyed by bhakti, it is unacceptable to say that he becomes qualified for savana, means only that he attains the respectability of a performer of the Soma Yaga. So, this is what Chakravarti Pad has to say. In this regard, it can be borne in mind that Sri Chakravarti Pad is offering this alternate interpretation or explanation of 333.6 specifically with the aim of demonstrating why Sri Rupa Pad cited 333.6 in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.1.21 to illustrate the principle that bhakti can destroy commenced sin. His concern is thus that the import of the purification described in 333.6 not be described in a manner that could leave anyone with a doubt that such purification is anything less than full destruction of commenced sin. Given that he does accept the view of Sri Samipad and Sri Jivapad in his Sarita Darshani, that the purification described in 333.6 also carries the import of the attainment of the respectability of a performer of the Soma Yaga. It would be unfounded to construe Sri Chakravarti Pad's intent in this second interpretation to be that he is arguing that dog cookers who have been purified by bhakti should literally go and conduct a Soma Yaga, even when they can be said from this second point of view to have direct ability to do so. Moreover, Sri Chakravarti Pad himself also states reasons in this second commentary why such dog cookers don't actually perform Soma Yagas. Okay, so when you read the first point that Chakravarti Pad makes, you might run with that and say, look, he's arguing for literal eligibility, therefore he would support literal practice, which is a fair argument. In other words, if someone's adamantly saying they can literally do this, then you wouldn't expect them to then object to the person actually doing it. You would think that if they were confident that the person was eligible, that they would support the person using the eligibility. However, this is the fine distinction that has to be grasped. Because elsewhere, Chakravarti Pad himself is also not supporting the actual literal practice. And in this same commentary, he goes on to say the following. And it is not to be said in this regard, when such a dog cooker has eligibility for yaga, why does he not perform it? That is, one should not object to this assertion that eligibility here refers specifically to actual eligibility itself and not just the respectability of those who have such eligibility, by saying from observation of the conduct of the cultured that it is unseen and unheard of for any dog cooker who has somehow engaged in bhakti to actually learn and conduct a yajna, because of his non-possession of shraddha in karma, on account of his being a pure bhakta. That is, the reason a dog cooker who has become a pure bhakta does not actually perform any yaga is not that he does not have actual eligibility to do so, but rather that he has no shraddha in the path of karma, and thus has no impetus to perform a yaga, which is part of the path of karma and not the path of bhakti, since he has shraddha in bhakti and thus remains ever engaged in act of bhakti alone instead of acts of karma. So Chakravarti Pad's point is this: he also is not supporting that someone who was, a quote-unquote dog cooker or an outcast ever actually go and do a yajna. What he's saying is that if a bhakta is said to have actual eligibility, then we don't have to say, oh, that's just honorability and not actual eligibility. Let it be actual eligibility. But who cares about the fact that he's eligible for the path of karma? He's a bhakta. He's following the path of bhakti. Why would he bother engaging in karma anyway? So he's not actually trying to say that bhaktas should do that. And as we've discussed many times, those who have adhikar for the path of bhakti, adhikar for bhakti is synonymous with loss of eligibility for the path of karma. Tabat karmani kurvita, as we hear Krishna himself say, do karma until you have shraddha in bhakti. Because once you have shraddha in bhakti, it becomes a digression from the path of bhakti to go back and do karma. This is, we discussed elaborately in regard to the adhikar for the path of uttam bhakti in the course on the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So Chakravarti Pad is looking at it from that angle and saying he's disagreeing with them not being accepted as literally eligible, but at the same time he's not supporting that they ever actually utilize that eligibility. And he's saying, yeah, let them be eligible, but don't bother ever using it because there's no point in using it anyway. It's like saying, I don't know, like if somebody really wants to travel long distances and then they get a driver's license and then something else happens and says, oh, you know what? You're now legally allowed to ride a bike. It's like, well, cool, but why would I ride a bike now when I can already drive a car? Now, obviously, don't mind this in the middle of, discussion of the environment and stuff like that. I'm not talking about that. Just for the sake of example, if you already have a more efficient means that has greater scope than effectiveness, and then you're said to be eligible for this lesser means, there's still no point in utilizing those lesser means when you already have greater means. So this is the way that he's also supporting the idea that a bhakta, even an outcast who chants the name, would not do well to go back and get an upanayan samskar or conduct a yajna, but he's giving a different reasoning for that conclusion. So, the first reason he mentioned here was also discussed earlier. Quote, the specific object of one's shraddha is the primary distinction between followers of the paths of karma and bhakti. And because followers of the path of bhakti have shraddha in bhakti rather than karma, they do not engage in acts of karma instead of bhakti, even if they have eligibility for such acts of karma. Sri Chakravarti Pad then offers a second consideration in this regard. So he goes on, quote, other householders born in noble families, that is, bhaktas who, unlike the aforementioned dog cooker, were born in the 3 upper varnas and underwent the necessary samskaras to become twice born by means of the savitra birth in their youth, however, although not possessed of shraddha in karma, still perform karma for the sake of social cohesion, as also, accordingly in the Gita, it is said, quote, considering also only this cohesion of society, you are obliged to act, that is, to perform the activities enjoined on the path of karma. So here what he's adding to this point, and the very significant thing to note, is he says, householders born in noble families. So he's saying, the people who were born eligible for that might, but are bhaktas, might still engage in karma, even though there's no gain for them to do it, and even though it wouldn't be necessary, or it's in one sense contravening their adhikar for bhakti, if it would facilitate social cohesion. In other words, if it were necessary in that social context for them to keep up those Brahminical rights that their family traditionally had, because that supports the broader society who still has shraddha in this path of karma, and who won't understand why bhaktas are neglecting it, and then end up doing Vaishnava ninda, or having a negative view of bhaktas when they can't understand why the bhaktas are actually beyond that. So better to just do a bit of, Agnihotra every day and let the people think you're like them, and then they respect you, and then that can give them a way to gradually respect bhaktas. So these are social dynamics that were definitely important 500 years ago or 300 years ago or 700 years ago. Nowadays, they're perhaps antiquated and not, directly relevant to the social challenges we typically face. But nevertheless, to draw out the import of what the acharyas are talking about, this would be the social context of the application. But anyway, I'll explain more. So it says, here he explains, as he also did in regard to the phrase jnana karma dhyanavritam, in the seminal definition of Uttama Bhakti in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.1.11, that when bhaktas who possess eligibility for acts of karma, as per the shastras that govern them, perform these acts without shraddha in them, only for the sake of social cohesion, then that is not a deviation from the path of Uttama Bhakti. If it were his intent to imply that someone not born in the three upper varnas should, by virtue of being purified by an act of bhakti, actually receive a savitra birth and conduct a soma yaga, he would not have spoken here of only, quote, householders born in noble families, sat kulotpanna grihasta, that is, bhaktas who are born in the three upper varnas, and thus eligible to become twice born. Meaning he would not have alluded to the standard rules that govern eligibility for the path of karma, which include birth in a family of the three upper varnas. So we just demonstrated in many of the previous classes how Jiva Gosvami, Sanatana Gosvami, Sridhar Goswami, Vishnu Chakravarti, they all accept birth as a criterion for being a Brahmin, or a Kshatriya, or a Vaishya. Now, and we already demonstrated how all these verses that seem to say that it's established by qualities don't override the necessity of the condition of birth as well. So Chakravarti Pad, right in consistency with all the other points he makes on this statement throughout his other works, even though the context doesn't have to do with anybody's birth, he himself brings the subject of birth into the discussion and says that this would be applicable in this case. So he himself is actually stipulating and supporting the idea that without taking that birth, no one would actually literally go and perform that activity. So there isn't then, if one's looking at this whole thing, to say, do any of these acharyas ultimately support the idea of someone not born in one of the three upper varnas going and receiving the Upanayan Samskar and then going and conducting Vedic yajnas? The answer is no. Sridhar Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, Jiva Gosvami, Vishnu Chakravarti, and all their works, no one supports this idea. In fact, they all speak to the contrary and say that this would not be the proper way for someone to proceed on the path of bhakti. Finally, he states a third reason why dog cookers who have been purified by bhakti do not actually perform soma yagas. Quote, in regard to the proposition of his, that is, the dog cooker who has become a pure bhakta's performance of karma, it is to be understood, on the contrary, that fear of slander from persons not conversant in Bhakti Shastra is also an impediment. Okay, so now he's giving another reason. And what's another reason that bhaktas shouldn't do this? Because if they do, all these other people are going to do ninda of that. And then that's going to make them into aparadhis. So Vaiṣṇavas are such that they don't offend people, and they take concerted measures to preclude people making offense to them or not understanding their behavior and then doing ninda of them. Sri Chakravarti Pad's point here is that common people in society who are not conversant in Bhakti Shastra would criticize a dog cooker who has once chanted a name of Bhagavan if he were to perform a soma yaga, because common persons not conversant in Bhakti Shastra would not understand that such a person has been purified of the sin of their low birth just by performing an act of bhakti. Rather, they would simply think that this dog cooker is transgressing the rules in the Shastra that govern the performance of yaga. Such persons would thus end up engaging in defamation, ninda of a Vaiṣṇava, a severe aparad, which creates an impediment to their own potential to acquire shraddha in the path of bhakti. Since no bhakta ever wants any such impediment should befall common people, no bhakta engages in conduct that is prone to be misunderstood by them and thus result in their committing offense. So this is a third reason. is that if people went against the established social norms and started doing this, other people would criticize it, and then that would lead to detriment for those other people. So would it be wise to now start doing this to try to change the social convention? Not according to Vishwanath Chakravarti. In summary, when bhaktas born in the 3 upper varnas perform yaga for the sake of social cohesion without shraddha in the act, it results in social cohesion. But if bhaktas of low birth were to perform yaga, it would not result in benefit to society, but rather detriment, as a result of contravention of established conduct and the contingency of defamation, and thus they refrain from doing so. Moreover, they have no impetus to perform yaga or other acts of karma anyway, because they have shraddha in the path of bhakti rather than the path of karma. It is thus not Sri Chakravarti Pad's intention in his commentary on the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.122, wherein he argues that dog cookers purified by bhakti do have full eligibility to perform a somayaga, to enjoin that they actually do so. Rather, it is his intent to ensure it is understood that the commenced sin that caused them to receive a low birth is indeed fully destroyed, and thus that they are not ineligible for the performance of somayaga, even though they still nonetheless need not and better not actually perform a somayaga, and thus need not or better not seek to receive a savitra birth and investiture with the sacred thread for the sake of doing so. Okay, so that concludes our discussion on those 2 verses in the Bhagavatam. So we have some further points on this whole subject. We're going to return to some statements from the the Digdarshani-tika on the Haribhakti Vilas, which we covered earlier, about how Sanatana Gosvami equates Vaiṣṇavas and Brāhmaṇas and what was intended by that. But we'll get to that in a later class, as well as other relevant topics from the Brihad Bhagavatamrita and the Bhakti Sandarbha. So a lot of technicality today. I think I'll leave it at that, just not to have to dive into too much of this in one go. So if anyone has comments, questions, corrections, or any other feedback, they're welcome to share at this time.
Gerald, hey, Pranam Babaji, I have a quick comment.
Okay. Yes.
So it was interesting to listen to the analysis of how, a dog eater or a dog cooker, so to speak, shouldn't engage in yajna or doing or getting the sacred thread, because then people will criticize that, the person shouldn't be doing that, because of a lack of understanding.
Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting because in Kali Yuga now, things are so topsy-turvy, and you and I have had some talks about this, but it seems to me like even now it's the opposite, where you could have people who now realize that Westerners shouldn't be receiving Upanayanam, and then they can criticize that and get aparad from that. So it's almost like, our mentality as aspiring bhaktas should be to just not have any reason to commit aparad, whether it's saying people who aren't Brahmins shouldn't become Brahmins, or the other way around, where people, sorry, I'm going to get myself in like a tongue twister here, but I just think it's interesting to note that, even the the so-called dog eaters, they, they're the, who are now Vaiṣṇavas, so we wouldn't really call them dog eaters, but and what to speak of a dog eater, right? A cow eater would be even worse than a dog eater. And, but the whole point is that even though those people, well, like me, who are so low born, when we consider the status of birth, still we can have this understanding of not to encourage or to foster aparad in others towards us. So, I don't know. I just thought that was interesting to listen to. So thank you for your, your elaboration on the topic.
Great. Well, that's a very nice point that you brought up, and I think it is very relevant for us in the modern day, where social circumstances do change, and we do encounter situations where there may be certain customs or attitudes which have become prevalent in certain communities, Gaudiya Vaishnava communities or Hindu communities, and we may have a view that those things are not in accord with the way that the acharyas that we choose to follow foresaw the way the conduct would be observed within the community that followed their teachings. So we have to be very tactful about that, definitely. We don't want to be perceived as criticizing others or as making people feel awkward or confused about what they're doing. So we see the conduct of the Goswamis themselves. They disagreed, so to speak, or they presented views that differed from the work of Ramanuja Acharya, of Madhvacharya, of Sridhar Samipada in some cases. So whenever they did so, they always did so without naming any names, and they did so not for the sake merely of disagreeing or for the sake of differentiating so as to acquire a new position. They have that statement in the Mahabharata, Rishir Nasabnacha Bhinnam, I think. How does it go? That you can't be a rishi unless you have your own opinion. Or unless you give some new idea or some different idea, you don't get any status. You're just washed away in history as someone who repeated whatever idea came before you. So historically, whoever started saying that idea is the one everyone remembers and not you. So if you want to be somebody, you got to do something different. So then some people differentiate just for the sake of trying to become somebody. So that will be, to betray the spirit, so to speak. In other words, if attitudes or practices or whatever are being voiced, they should be voiced because they are really merit they're being practiced, not just because we want to be somebody who said something. So who and when someone is motivated by what, that's also beyond what we can judge. But we can at least look at ourselves and try to align ourselves with these type of ideals and say that if we do engage in topics where we know there are differences of opinion or there are controversies and things like that, that we're talking about these things when it's necessary and for the sake of clarifying issues according to who said what, when, and where historically. And then beyond that, it's up to individuals to decide what they want to follow. If somebody prefers the opinion of this person or that person, then at that point, we don't need to start playing the I'm right and you're wrong game or, that kind of stuff. Whoever you want to follow or whatever you want to stake your faith in, that's fine. But we do have a job, if you will, or a role, so to speak, to at least just bring clarity and to be able to respectfully discuss what has been said by who and when. And if we want to interpret it differently, that's also fine. And we can also understand where is it that our interpretations differ and where does that difference lie? And then nevertheless, all the while, respect everyone, whatever their opinions may be and whatever path they choose to take. Not that, oh, you didn't accept my opinion, now I can self-justify my disrespect of you. It's like, no, then we ourselves dig ourselves in a pit, So, whether it's politics or it's spirituality, whatever it is, one of the core glue, if you will, that holds the social fabric together is the capacity to respect people that think differently than you. This is crucial to living in a community, living in a country, having a functioning political system, having a valuable scope for spiritual discourse and hermeneutics. All of it revolves around our capacity to deeply see respectability in others, even if those things don't necessarily match our personal preferences or our own level of understanding. So if we can keep some of that in mind when we discuss these things, then hopefully that will engender a sense of mutual respect and whatever individual practices may be or communal affiliations may be or what have you. But I'm just throwing this out there to complement what you said. I thought you brought up a very good point.
I have just a thought. Why did you prefer the expression dog cooker and not the one we're used to, dog eater?
A dog cooker and dog eater. They're both mentioned. Actually, in the previous class, Jiva Gosvami cited one as a synonym for the other. So some verses mention swapacha, or this one says svada. So they're in the scripture, so to speak, synonymous, and both are mentioned. Because, I mean, I don't think anybody eats raw dog. Raw dog meat might be too extreme for human beings. So if you're a dog cooker, if you're a dog eater, you or at least somebody in your family is a dog cooker too.
There's a habit in new circles to give the Upanayana thread to new devotees.
Okay.
So that they can do the deity worship and they can perform, yagya for weddings and things like this. Even though they were going in the West and they're completely out of the system. So basically, I didn't realize that all these acharyas actually said this is not proper.
Yeah, I mean, from all the research that I've done, if you read Sri Goswami, Jiva Goswami, Sanatana Gosvami, Vaiṣṇava Chakravarti, their opinion is consistent, it's one, and it's clear. But we know that, in the 20th century, some changes were made by some people. And now that's, as our friend mentioned, that has also shifted social norms and perceptions to some extent. So if we just sort of come along with this historical understanding, we can also end up being rude. We can also end up treading on people's sentiments. And we don't want to cause, hard feelings to people. So we're trying to preserve these historical precedents and the viewpoints of these acharyas, but at the same time, in my personal opinion, I'll just say, in the present day, if someone is part of a community or a way of thinking where some of that is going on, that we would, just because of that, not see the Vaishnavata of the person. In other words, that would be a big mistake on our part. That, okay, these things are customary, and how many people have studied all these things, and how many people can read all this Sanskrit stuff and analyze this? Not that many. Most people, they meet somebody, this is the norm of the community, they follow that, and they're doing it with their faith and their heart, and in one sense, that's very respectable. Even if, from a historically scriptural perspective, it might be off in some sense. Nevertheless, on an individual level, that person might be right on in their intentions and their efforts, and so we should respect that person. We should honor their attempts to do that, and whether it's even necessary to talk about it with them, maybe not. Everything just depends on the circumstances and what the situation is, and what's really in the interest and the benefit of the individuals involved and the community more broadly.
And anyway, these are Varnashram things.
Right.
Not to do directly with bhakti.
Exactly.
I wanted to add one more thing, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Or I guess more of a question about your thoughts on something. So, just as you were just talking, I guess what's interesting to me is then when I think of like the samskara rites that I guess we know about. Technically, those rites are for the upper three varnas. They're not for, the dog cookers, so to speak. So then it makes me wonder, like, okay, well, when you have such a mass, because obviously there's a huge mass of bhaktas who, maybe it's even the majority, outside of India, of dog eaters or cow eaters who have now, chant the holy name and have received diksha and things like that.
Oops. Internet.
Nope, the lines dropped.
So then what's like, deal with such a
The connection's a bit slow, I can't understand
because
anything.
just have been in a unfulfilled, know anybody or get married or or whatever. I mean that's the best thing. Never say you don't label a birth. That's all.
Yeah, maybe it's just giving it really slow because it's broken up. I don't know, but I can't follow this. Okay, there it says. Dadaji, I couldn't make out most of what you said. The connection got broken up there, so I really couldn't grasp. You wanted to add something to what you said before, and after that I didn't really get it.
Can you hear me clearly now?
Yeah, it seems to be clear now.
So I was just saying, I'll try to be more concise. Like, what is the role of rites of passage for bhaktas who essentially have, taken birth in the families of dog eaters or cow eaters, because if Brahminical rites, so to speak, like first grain ceremony, naming ceremony, hair parting ceremony, all these samskars we've heard of, if those are really just for the three upper varnas, then should we be doing those? Should we not? And not your opinion necessarily, but even just scripturally, like what would be the proper thing to do?
Some of those, to my knowledge, are also practicable for those not of the upper three varnas. It depends which ones, and as they mentioned, Shudras receive samskaras that don't require the recitation of mantras. So it and there's also different regional customs regarding how they're done. So I would say it gets a bit looser at that level, depending on the region people are from, the family traditions people have, and how many of those things are practicable for others, especially, Indian family traditions from those who are not of the three upper varnas. They also have different varieties of these things. So I would think, it's not something I've looked into, but I would think there would be a way of designing a set of samskaras that wouldn't be crossing the birth distinction rules, but at the same time providing some of these sacraments for people that like to mark significant points in the education of people. I think there's probably some middle ground that some scholars could chalk out by studying the relevant Smriti Shastras, but it's not a topic that I've ever delved into, so I can't comment specifically.
Thanks.
Maharaj, I'm thinking about, there's so many ways this plays out, but who anticipated that Gaudiya Vaishnavas would spread around the world, and that there would be temples opened in Ohio, and that there's Radha Krishna deities installed in all these places, and that there's no born Brahmins to worship them, and that someone has to do it. And it seems to me that we have to make a distinction between karma samskaras and those of Vaishnavas. Vaishnavas, like you say, Vaishnavas, we do certain things. We do have small yogis sometimes now and then. If we prohibited all of that, it would be very difficult to spread Krishna consciousness. So, and then you have the whole thing of women being gurus. I imagine the people that object to it, they're basing it somewhat on the Vedas, that these women are not born in Brahmin families, they're not highly qualified. How can they be gurus? So this is a huge issue. And I'm just expressing my thoughts and not knowing where we go. I guess we're going to talk about this again next week.
Yeah, there'll be further discussion on the topic, but I'll just say that, there are some different types of rites and practices that don't require the particular mantras and practices that are reserved for the twice born. And certainly you don't need you don't need an Upanayan Sanskar to do Radha Krishna Puja, right? All you need is Vaishnav Diksha for that. So definitely all matters of bhakti are fully contained within the Vaishnava Diksha, which is accessible to anyone of any birth, irrespective of anything about twice-born culture. And, with some nice Radha Krishna Puja and Nama Sankirtan and all the other things that are specific to the path of bhakti, I don't see any lack of that, as anything lacking in that, in the capacity to, quote, spread it around the world, that we would need to do things that are reserved only for the twice-born in order to conduct an international practice of the path taught in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. I don't see anything lacking there. So I think there's definitely scope for propagation of the tradition based purely on Vaishnava Samskaras and the practices that are eligible for everyone irrespective of their birth whatsoever. And that might even be probably more appealing to all the people born internationally who are ineligible for all these things anyway, if we brought to them a Vaishnava culture that essentially just made the birth issue obsolete and socially rewarded everything Vaishnava and more or less, marginalized everything non-Vaishnava that pertained to caste. That might go over well, as opposed to saying no, we're going to bring you into this redefined concept of caste. Maybe we don't need to bother with that. We could just say bhakti's for everybody and we're doing bhakti. But that's just my 2 cents.
I like it. Sounds good.
Would you consider Diksha a rite of passage?
Definitely. Diksha, we can say, is a rite of passage.
So Siddhapanari too?
Yeah, in some way.
In some way, yeah. Interesting, I never thought of it. Wow, okay. Nice, thank you. Very much.
All right, well, if that's it, then we can sign off from here. And as I said, this is a long and tedious commentary that was going to go on for a long time. Pardon me for so much technicality. This is definitely atypical of our discussion of Padyavali as a whole, but we just thought once we're diving into it, once and for all, we'll go into all the nitty-gritty on this and then, happily proceed thereafter. So, until next time, Vaiṣṇavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Okay, so the experience